Welcome to the Food Junkies Podcast. Here, we aim to provide you with the experience, strength, and hope of professionals actively working on the front lines in the field of food addiction. The purpose of our show is to educate you, the listener, and increase overall awareness about food addiction as a disease with abstinence as the solution. Here, we talk about all things recovery. Most importantly, how to thrive rather than just survive. So stay positive, make a change for yourself, tell others about your change, and hopefully the message will spread.
Welcome to the Food Junkies Podcast. My name is Dr. Vera, and I am your co-host today along with Clarissa Kennedy, speaking with Dr. Erik Fisher. Carl Fisher is a psychiatrist and clinical researcher who specializes in addiction medicine. He completed his psychiatric training at Columbia University, where he now serves as assistant professor of clinical psychiatry. Dr. Fisher struggled with his own alcohol addiction and has been in recovery for over a decade. He draws on his clinical experience as well as his own journey of addiction recovery in his recent book, The Urge: Our History of Addiction, which traces the history of how addiction has been conceptualized and addressed through human civilization. We at Food Junkies are particularly interested in how food addiction might be viewed from his historical lens. Welcome, Carl.
It's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. We always like to start with a bit of personal story. Like, you're quite open about your story of addiction and recovery. What got you to be interested in the whole area of psychiatry and addiction, and particularly this book and the historical focus of the book?
What got me interested in psychiatry is different than what got me interested in addiction. I was interested in neuroscience and clinical research in medical school. I did a year training and extra research fellowship in neuroscience, in brain stimulation, actually. And at that point, I was really interested in how brain creates mind and what is the nature of consciousness and how do we make sense of psychiatric disorders. But I was really allergic to addiction in a clinical sense. I didn't want anything to do with it. I told myself I was totally uninterested, probably because I recognized it in myself. Yeah, like you said, I'm open about this. I'm happy to talk about it more, but I wasn't interested in addiction ever, really. I had to enter recovery or I would lose my medical license. At the end of medical school, I graduated from Columbia University with honors and had gone to my top choice residency, and I thought I was on top of the world, but I was also getting worse and worse consequences from alcohol, and then a little later Adderall, and then cocaine, which just put a jetpack on the whole production. So I wound up in a stimulant-induced mania. I had to get psychiatric treatment. Thank goodness it was over vacation. And at that point, I entered treatment. And the only reason I stayed in treatment is I was a doctor, because in the process, I'd gotten enrolled in a physician health program, which provided some supervision. And then after a little bit, I went to them and I said, I don't think I need this. And your recommendations sound a little too much like overkill. So yeah, I'm not going to go to inpatient. I'd rather do it this other way. And they said, no, you can't practice medicine if you don't follow through with the recommendations. You revealed yourself as a physician in recovery. And so I dragged myself along kicking and screaming for a little while there. And it was only after several years in recovery that I got interested in the clinical side of addiction, and then got interested in this book. And at the risk of blathering on, I'll stop it there, but we can talk more about how the book came out of all of that.
The historical focus, like what got you interested in that? Because most of the time that people write about this, it's about the biological aspect, the disease model, etc. But you actually focus on unusual, like more of a novelistic approach. I don't know, more holistic approach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, holistic in the best sense of the word, not holistic in terms of like crystals and dream catchers. No offense to people who like crystals and dream catchers, but like the true meaning of the word holism. Holism is a philosophical word, and it means looking at the whole picture. It means looking at all the different components that go into an explanation. And that's exactly what I was looking for. I couldn't have put a word on it back at the time I was looking, but at the same time I got interested in the nature of addiction, I also shifted my focus more away from research, neuroscience, into bioethics. And my division was originally called at Columbia, the place where I still am, the Division of Ethics, Law, and Psychiatry. They have a more recent word that puts in policy, which is also relevant too. But the ethical, legal, social, psychiatric, philosophical components of how we make sense of mental disorders. I like neuroscience. I think neuroscience has a lot to offer in the understanding of addiction and related problems. I think non-neuroscience clinical and epidemiological research has done a lot also to clarify the phenomenon and for example, draw distinctions between self-identified addiction and the broader ambit of substance use disorders. But as I was looking into understanding addiction from a scholarly standpoint, I felt really dissatisfied. At that time in early recovery, I thought, I really want to understand this thing. I'm coming into more and more of an acceptance that I have this thing, whatever this thing is. The sort of stereotypical, oversimplified explanations aren't really working for me. And so then what? I would love to find a theory of addiction. And so a lot of people have theories of addiction. There are too many theories of addiction. Robin West has a great book called Theory of Addiction. It's got over 30 theories. And I felt as I was looking through that book and books like it and other scholarly accounts that people were just palpating part of the elephant, that they were breaking off one little piece of the puzzle, this old parable. Yeah. It's different people touching an elephant. Some people say, oh, it's got this strong base. That must mean it's a tree. Another person grabs the trunk and waves it around and says, oh, it must be a snake. Nobody has a big enough picture holistically at the whole perspective. And so I increasingly had the sense that I would just say other disciplines. History is the hook. History is the narrative through line because that's the way to organize it. That's the way to make sense of how ideas about addiction evolved over time. But what I was trying to do is to weave in not just history and not just individual stories or policy stories, but also the arts, literature, other humanities, sociology, economics, and especially philosophy and the ways that people have made sense of brain and mind and choice and will and volition, because I felt that all those things were very useful. And many times the psychiatric and addiction medicine related quote unquote theories didn't have a strong enough basis. They didn't really have the conceptual foundation to really define their terms or describe what was going on. And so I found the history really helpful in terms of organizing that kind of thinking.
Okay,
and there's a lot of ways the history was helpful, but one of the most clear ways that I didn't know was going to take shape after time is that looking at the ways different people and societies thought about addiction at different points gives us almost like a dipstick to assess how people made sense of people with addiction problems, how people made sense of these bigger questions in psychiatry and in neuroscience. So in a way, like ideas about people with addiction became ideas about the concept. It became an intellectual and a cultural history.
And the other thing you do as part of that broader picture is you bring in your own story. And I'd like to just take a segue for a second because you are so explicit in the book. I'm really interested because we never get a chance to ask this question, but I think you're a perfect person. The idea of the wounded healer. Can personal recovery inform professional treatment? Is it to be trusted? Can it be blinded? It's definitely more empathic. You can be more compassionate. So just generally that idea of what are the pros and cons of being the wounded healer in your workplace?
Yeah. My first reaction, honestly, is anyone who thinks that they're not a wounded healer should do some examination. The idea that anybody is without wounds is like skating along on the surface of life, perfectly flourishing, no problems. They don't need to pay attention to their attention. They don't need to pay attention to the way they work with their mind. That's very dangerous. I would not want to go to a psychiatrist or a psychotherapist like that. So the first step is recognizing our woundedness collectively, I would suggest. And that's a crucial component of training. And that was also true in my training as a psychiatry resident in a more psychodynamic kind of Freudian orientation. Even in that model, people said, and that's one of the nice things about Freudianism is that they say you need your own treatment, but to understand yourself so you can go forward. There's lots we could say about Freud, but that general principle, you should know thyself before you go out, I think is crucial for all clinicians. But yes, absolutely. One's status as a person in recovery can be a tremendous source of bias, and it has caused tremendous amounts of harm over the history of substance use disorder treatment and addiction treatment. The main way being that people come to the idea or are even explicitly told and take up the idea that there's one way to get sober, that there's only one way to do it. Yeah. And it becomes a one-size-fits-all program. I describe in the book, there are many forces that coalesced to make our predominant model of addiction treatment a one-size-fits-all pathway in the 1970s, 1980s. But this was a big one. This was a really big one, is that a lot of people who were and the people who wind up taking jobs as recovery counselors are the ones that really care, and they probably have a very important personal history. And of course, they're going to hold very tightly, some at least are going to hold very tightly to one particular model of recovery. I think it's important. I think that there are a lot of good people doing work about peers in recovery and counseling and how to train coaches. And we're very early days when it comes to those types of developments and professionalizing in a positive way these things that have already been going on for decades and decades. But I think it's really important to think clearly and get good training and supervision on these questions like individual bias, the role and the extent of self-disclosure, the kind of supervision, how exactly do you stay open to multiple recovery pathways, all that stuff. I think it's really crucial.
Do you ever regret being so candid about your story?
No, honestly, no. I had to stop and think about that for a second, but there was certainly a part of me that was worried around the time of publication where I thought, what am I doing? My son's going to be pissed. Maybe when my son's older, he'll be like, Dad, my date Googled your book. How'd you do it? That could happen. I don't know. We'll have to see. Talk to me in, I don't know, hopefully 40 years when he starts dating. But I had those worries pre-publication. And certainly especially around the time of publication, when I had an op-ed in the New York Times and I gave a lot of radio interviews and there was a whole publication blitz, that there were some random trolls online who would try to use my recovery status as a sort of lever to criticize me. I doesn't know what he's talking about. I was reassured that there was a pretty even split. Some people thought I was this anti-recovery skeptic in the vein of, say, Stanton Peele or something. And they'd be like, this idiot doctor thinks that addiction isn't real. And I'd be like, this guy didn't read my work. It's usually a guy, by the way. This guy didn't read my work. And then on the other side, somebody would be like, this guy was just proselytizing for AA. And I'm like, okay, that's interesting. You must not have read my work either. Because like when people are that, it really didn't bother me that much. I've never been publicly shamed in the way, like John Ronson has this great book, So You've Been Publicly Shamed. I've never really been publicly shamed. I don't know what would happen if that happened to me. I guess the door is still open, but I can let you know if I do. But honestly, this is what Ryan Hampton said to me on my own podcast, which I really loved and have carried with me, is he said, I asked if he had any request of the audience, and he said, if you have the ability to do it safely, please recover out loud. Just please do it. Wow. And it will probably pay you dividends in connections, in a feeling of service, in a feeling of usefulness. And I think that's a really important proviso if you can do it safely. Some people might put their jobs or their livelihood or just their own mental health at risk. Yeah. So you should be careful about that. But I do think that there's every day more and more people who are recovering out loud. And it's a really beautiful thing to do.
Wow. Thank you. What a beautiful answer. Okay. So let's talk about your book, The Urge. Can you give us just a paragraph summary of this memoir / historical perspective / holistic of addiction? Just what will the reader get when they read your book? And then we'll talk about some of the ideas.
Sure. Yeah, I'll keep it short. I'm sure we'll expand on it. The easiest way to answer this is that I tried to set out to write a book that I myself wanted, which was a book that looked at addiction across the ages, across different cultures, as synthetically as possible to try to get a handle on what this phenomenon is. The core question really is, what happened to me? What happened to my family? My parents, as I describe in the book, are alcoholics. And I just started at the beginning and looked at historical accounts. There are people who suffer from addiction, like ancient Chinese scholars, or the oldest example is actually a gambling addiction case. Somebody described in a hymn in the Rig Veda from thousands of years ago, the ancient Vedic manuscript. There's also societal level descriptions. There's a lot about different medical and scientific responses to addiction. And I just try to make sense of all the different ways people have tried to make sense of it all. The upshot is it comes through the present day. And what I saw is cycles that kept on repeating themselves. And there was always overlap and there were always complications. But basically, there were four big ways that organizations and societies responded to addiction. There were prohibitionist crackdowns. There was reductionist attempts to just boil it down to the materialism of basic science. And this is true even before we had what we would call basic science today. There were clinical approaches. This is related to reductionism, but not necessarily. It's more about the helping professions, one-on-one direct connections. And then the fourth response was mutual help. And there are many different iterations of mutual help, including preceding AA. I would have loved to have found a connection between, say, Native American mutual help groups preceding the American Republic and, say, 12-step programs. And I couldn't find one. I was very motivated. Speaking of bias, I was very biased. I was like, wow, this would be a great story if I could trace this through. Maybe it went through the Quakers in Baltimore and maybe there's a way it influenced Bill Wilson. No, didn't find it. It's not that there's one better or worse response to addiction. It's that these cycles keep on repeating themselves over time. And in looking at those cycles in the individuals and the arguments that are advanced in the context of those cycles, we better understand the phenomenon altogether. And there's a lot more I could say about that. But I'm curious to hear how you, because we're on the Food Junkies podcast, I'm curious to hear what about it sparks your interest, because I wanted to put more behavioral addictions in there. And there are a few little glimmers of people struggling with sex addiction, whatever. But in the end, I wasn't able to really talk about, I had my hands full to write a reasonably sized book just on primarily substance addiction as it was.
We see a lot of similarities. And one of them is that we're struggling now with the mutual help versus I don't know what you would have called it, but what we would now call the disease model, the neurochemical, the physical model of addiction. So I'd like to know, because we're still struggling with that, like how do we define the parameters of food addiction? So do you still, in your overview, buy into the quote disease or disorder model, and where do you diverge from that?
Oh man, we could fill a whole day-long conference with that question, frankly. And I think a lot of people, this is where my background in philosophy and ethics comes in, is because I think a lot of people make conceptual category mistakes about the language we use to describe human suffering. And a lot of times people will think they're advancing a model, and it's not really a model. A very good philosopher of psychiatry, Owais Aftab, has a great Substack. And the great things about writing a book is I've come into contact with all these smart scholars across the world. And he just has a post on his own Substack, just I think over the weekend, this past weekend, about how people understand models. What is this word model? What are people saying when they say model? And Niels Bohr, when he was trying to describe the atom, he had a model of the atom. And that was a diagram with physics calculations, and there were predictions that could be proven or disproven, and it all hung together in a pretty straightforward way. Watson and Crick, when they built DNA, when they built the DNA structure, that's a model. That's a very clear model with measurements. And of course, we can't measure things that precisely and predict them that precisely in 2024. Mental health problems cut across multiple dimensions. They can't all be reduced to neuroscience, but just using the same word model to a set of, say, claims or assertions about addiction is, I think, putting the cart before the horse. It's not really a model. It's a set of arguments. And that's the feeling I got when I read this theory of addiction book that I was talking about, is people call a thing a model. Really, it's a very useful, behavioral economic take on a thing, or a very useful neuroscience take on a thing. But the problem I have with reductionism in the book, and all the many forms it comes up, is when something is overly reductionistic, it says that the scientific level, the neurobiological level, the molecular level, whatever it might be, is the best level to understand this thing. The problem is not incorporating ideas from basic science. I love basic science. I did basic science research. The problem is when somebody says, this is the fundamental level, the most important level. And someday, if we only invest enough money in, say, brain scan, molecular mapping, we will get to a point where we can perfectly describe the system and we will be able to cure addiction or whatnot. That's deeply misguided. People have tried that over and over again. You might think that you're on the cusp of it today. People thought they were on the cusp of doing that in the 1990s. People thought they were on the cusp of doing it in the 1880s. There was this guy, Keeley, who was also a profiteer, and he started all of these really wacky treatment centers. But he said, addiction is a disease and I have the cure. And he would inject people with his red, white, and blue syringe. And he called it the gold cure. But just about the only thing that was in the syringe that was not in the syringe was gold. It didn't have gold in it, but it had all these other chemicals. And it was basically a placebo.
But wasn't there another one where they pulled their teeth out?
Yeah, there was all sorts of madness. There was one that had cocaine. There was a pills that had cocaine, the Hay Litchfield antidote. They all have these names like the serum or the antidote or whatever. This is the patent medicine created in the late 19th century. So the point is that, I don't know, I feel like I'm giving you a long prelude to even beginning to answering the question. But I don't think it's like the division between harm reduction, the supposed division between harm reduction and abstinence, which is not a division. It's not it's that the people who are actually doing good work in this field say these things are perfectly compatible. There are lots of people long-term, very traditional 12-step based recovery who love abstinence, and they're doing really aggressive harm reduction work. It's not a dichotomy. It's a false dichotomy created by rhetoric and tribalist thinking. And so I don't think there needs to be a division between the so-called disease model versus other more holistic models. It's just one level of analysis. For me, the only place where I have a problem with you is if you're telling me this is the only way.
Yeah.
The best way. The only way and the best way, it all reduces down to neuroscience, because that is hubristic and it's not going to get us anywhere.
You asked, how does this relate to food junkies in our population right now at the stage of having acknowledged that food addiction exists, but now how do we conceptualize that entity? And I just published a paper which is presenting a model based on Koob's model, the allostatic model of addiction, that there is a chronic progression and it can be divided into stages. And it's relevant. So if you would be part of this discussion, where would you say, okay, let's be careful because it's a model and therefore it's presenting conceptual ideas, which will then buzz out other ideas.
So tell me more where you have questions or where you think there might be some debate. What is the most controversial part of what you're proposing?
That it even exists, that we can apply food. First of all, that there is a chronic progressive nature of addiction, which is reductionist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't have a problem with reductionism per se. I have a problem with overly reductionistic thinking that reduces things only to one level. But we needed reductionism to get a COVID vaccine. We needed reductionism to get a measles vaccine. There's a lot of good that reductionism does.
Okay, but then the bigger issue, which you brought up yourself, which is the harm reduction versus the abstinence model, definitely exists in the food addiction world as it exists in the larger addiction world. Elaborate a little bit on that. How can we be compatible as opposed to diametrically opposed?
Yeah. Let me start with some of the things you said about your own model, and then maybe we'll see if we can bring it back around to harm reduction versus abstinence. Okay. So you said you have a model that proposes that food addiction follows something similar to Kube's model, where that shows that it is chronic and progressive, and that by explaining some of the neurobiology of food addiction, you can explain why it's chronic and progressive. Maybe there's something in there about why it affects some people, but not other people, et cetera. I have no problem with all that. An interesting wrinkle that came up from the history is the way people have used different descriptors in relation to addiction. Progressive, one of these big tripwires. Progressive is one of these words like disease. It's one of these words like model that people can take in different ways. But progressive could just mean chronic. Progressive could just mean this is a thing, this is an entity, this is a phenomenon that happens to recur over time. It's hard to go, it sticks around. The tendency to stick around doesn't mean it never stops, but it sticks around.
But it sticks around and gets worse.
It tends to get worse, yes. But people have also used the word progressive, including drawing on some very traditionalist, even orthodox interpretations of some of the 12-step literature to say this is destined to get worse. This will invariably get worse. Once you're on this road, there's no coming back. And that's a much stronger claim. So even within that one word, this is where I think conceptual analysis and some of the philosophical and ethical analysis can be helpful to people even doing basic research comes up. There are variations within that word. That word can look innocuous, but it means different things. And as far back as the 1970s, there's a really interesting group. They're still around, the SOBA, which had a big controversy, which we described, even before they published their major work.
Can you say a little bit for people who don't know them? It's such an interesting story.
Oh, yeah. So the first thing I was going to say is they started off in basic behaviorist research in the 70s, and they worked with this guy named Mansell Pattinson, who would have been a giant in the field, except he was killed in a drunk driving accident, which is a great tragedy. But very early on in their psychological training, they got curious about definitions and characterizations of addiction. And so as early as the 1970s, I have a slide that I put up in professional talks where they list out, what do people mean when they say addiction is a disease? And they came up with all these different entities. And one claim was that it was progressive, meaning it invariably and necessarily goes forward. One is it's irreversible. No matter what you do, you can't reverse the course. One is that it's unitary, that all people with the situation are the same or are alike in very clear ways. One is that it's bounded, that there's a clear dividing line between the quote unquote normal population and the rest. And all of those characteristics of an entity model of addiction matter because there's strong evidence against each of those components, right? It's certainly the case that a lot of people with addiction tend to progress. But if you're going to say that once somebody meets a criteria for addiction, they necessarily progress, we have great epidemiological data going back to the 1970s that say that even people with very severe substance use problems tend to naturally remit. This is one of the great mysteries of addiction epidemiology. And it caused a lot of consternation and a lot of debate and even like warring press conferences in the early 1980s when things got all heated. That's when like Elizabeth Taylor and the Betty Ford Center, and there's all these celebrities. It's a moment not dissimilar from our own where there are a lot of like celebrity interested in recovery. The Sobels themselves looked at a different component of the entity model. They did irreversibility. So they said, by the time they were working, they said, okay, there have been all these big studies that say that progression is not necessarily the case in every single person. That if we study at a population level, whether it's people with heroin problems returning from Vietnam or whether it's people diagnosed as alcoholic by the NIAAA, which used to do more clinical work back then, some people seem to get better on their own without intervention. Okay, fine. So that's a progression part. What if we actually take people who are really tough cases, bring them into a hospital and treat them with really hardcore behavioral, like B.F. Skinner style behaviorist psychology, electric shocks and training in moderate drinking, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they actually found some evidence that they could move the dial a little bit toward reversibility. And then people took this ball and ran with it and said, on one side, it got very polarized very quickly. On one side, people were saying, oh, this proves that addiction is nonsense. It's all reversible if you just get the right treatment. On the other side, people said, there's no chance this couldn't be possible. When in reality, what happened is that it just moved the needle a little bit on somebody's tendency to suffer from addiction problems. Many of the people in those studies, even though the results have stood up to scrutiny, had really rough lives. It's not like they got a magic pill and all of a sudden their addiction was cured. So there are always like nuances and shades of gray to the interpretation of this type of research. But the bigger story about Sobel's is that it's to set up this firestorm and with like lawsuits and battles in the front page New York Times, and they eventually just decamped to Canada. And I asked them, did you have to run away? They said, no. I interviewed them from the book, and they said, no, it was just a happy coincidence. They're very good researchers, but it sure was good for them because there was like a true firestorm, and they were getting sued. They ran out of money. It was the whole production. I could have written a whole chapter on the Sobels. I didn't have enough space. But again, like the point of all this is that tempers run hot, especially when, getting back to your earlier question, when people have a personal history, they have a lived experience of addiction, they care a lot about it, they see a lot of people hurt by a lot of bad treatment, a lot of nonsense in the popular press, a lot of nonsense in bad treatment that exists even in supposedly reputable centers, and they think this is dangerous. Put the wrong ideas about there, it's going to kill people. And so on any side of the issue, people can really fall into rhetoric and division. It was my hope in the book to just unpack some of these controversies and difficult questions that we could open up the perspective and defuse the polarization a little bit just by going deep and looking at all sides of the issue.
Okay, so one of the issues is addiction, a disease, and then there's the harm reduction piece, which I hope we get to. What are some other misconceptions or quarrels that we have in the addiction field?
Yeah, just to be clear, I don't necessarily take a position on whether addiction is or is not a disease. I think that word is doing a lot of work. I worry that the word disease is misleading, at least in some cases. It's a double-edged sword. I've talked to people like David Sheff, the author of Beautiful Boy, and he also describes this in his work, that some of the arguments that come out of and are anchored to the disease narrative are very helpful for evoking compassion. My friend Beth Macy says the same thing, that she would go talk to sheriffs in Ohio and see how some of the ideas associated with this disease narrative are really helpful. So I'm not saying it's all nonsense. I personally find disease or ideas about disease useful as a sort of red flag to say what specifically is being argued here, because it's like a loose, baggy term that different people mean in different ways. And I wouldn't even say that like to call something a disease or is not a misconception. I think it just misses the point because it often obscures the specific arguments or assertions that are being made. But you asked about other misconceptions. I think another misconception has to do with the nature of drugs themselves. And this is probably interesting regarding food. There's a tradition for a lot of reasons in addiction research, in traditional substance-related addiction research, to say that the drug is doing all the work, that the drug is deterministically causing a sequence of events in the brain, and that's the reason somebody gets addicted. It endows the drug with all the power. And there are certain drugs that are good drugs, and those are quote-unquote addictive. And then there are other drugs that are not addictive. Maybe they're habit-forming but not addictive, or maybe they're not even habit-forming. And then we come up with these labels that don't really mean anything. Because as you can see, people get addicted to food, people get addicted to gambling, people get addicted to messaging. Forget about social media or video games. People get addicted to WhatsApp. I look at my friends who have older kids, just the messaging and texting can be, it's not always, but it can be an addictive relationship. So this idea of investing the drug with all the power and then dividing things up into good drugs and bad drugs, I think is a major misconception. And one big story in the book, which probably also has analogies to food addiction and industrialized food, is the role of industry, is the way the alcohol industry in particular has really warped this narrative to their own interests.
Can you elaborate a bit more on that?
Oh, yeah, all day. I'd be happy to. But
that was a cliffhanger.
Yeah. I was curious about, seed this in your mind. I'd be curious to hear about industrialized food because I don't know as much about what it is like Frito-Lay trying to guide the food addiction landscape or whatnot. Because the truth especially in the alcoholism field is going back over half a century. The beverage industry, and even before that, even in the gin craze in the UK, which is roughly the gin craze in the UK, which is roughly 1720 to 1750, the distillers in the beverage industry had a strong hand in influencing ideas about addiction, or as they called it back then, habitual drunkenness. And so it's always in the interests of the addiction supply industries to put the onus back on the individual.
Oh, for sure. The British Medical Journal published something, I think it was like 20 years ago, about the sugar industry, manipulated the research, much in the same way as we see with tobacco early days. But mainly, to be quite honest, mainly we just get dismissed. They just ignore us. We're at that stage and we're trying to become a nuisance enough that they actually have to address us.
When you're like Ralph Nader and they're sending in people to try to seduce you in the mall, then you know that you've hit it big.
But it was the same, like big tobacco. A lot of the people that own big tobacco bought like Nestle, Nabisco, all of that, and they manipulated the food, made it more addictive. And the problem was they used like the bliss point and they used all these different things. So we are proposing that it's really food is a substance use disorder over behavioral. And we're using the NOVA classification scale for ultra processed food addiction because we know these foods can't be found in nature. They are scientifically manipulated and create a dopamine response in the brain.
Yes. Yeah. And I'm totally on board with that. If somebody made the strong claim that there is a class of addictive foods that are an entirely separate category from quote unquote non-addictive foods, and that the addictive foods are something uniquely addicting, I would have a problem with that. But I certainly think that processed industrialized food is stronger than lettuce. And heroin is stronger than lettuce as well. I think that's a George Koob quote. He says, of course, alcohol is stronger than broccoli, but it's all on a spectrum in the sense that people can have addictive relationships to any number of behaviors. That it's all a behavior. Substance addiction is a behavioral addiction in the sense that you need to have the behavior of putting the substance in your body. That
the thing about
the substance doesn't put itself there.
The thing about food, with both behavior and the substance, becomes an addictive process. If you're drinking alcohol, the more you drink, obviously, the more the addiction takes hold, as it were. The neuroadaptation happens. And what happens with food addiction is people have to eat quickly, which we see.
Yes.
A binge eater, and then throw it up and eat some more. And there's a frenetic quickness of it because you want to get that substance in to match. You got to eat a lot quickly. So there's huge amounts and quick. That's what we see with food addiction, almost as if to compensate for the fact that with alcohol or cocaine, it's easier to take those other substances, but food addiction ramps it up so that it becomes equivalent. And because it's so ubiquitous, that's what makes it so hard to quit.
Yes. Yeah, no, exactly. I have friends and colleagues who identify as people in Overeaters Anonymous, as other types of eating disorders. And they say, and I believe it's, you had to take your substance of choice 3 times a day and then just stop at a particular point, and you would have a much harder road. I'm very grateful that I get to stop using Adderall and cocaine and alcohol. That's very simple for me. I just don't touch it. And there are a lot of addictive processes where you just don't have luxury.
I recall reading somewhere that I think in the Urge that you actually identified, at least acknowledged, that food addiction existed and that you might have your own somewhat relationship with it. I don't know. Would you say that's the case?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I don't know what I would identify as necessarily. It hasn't been enough of a problem in my life that I've really addressed it. I went to the gym today, then I went for a bike ride. I'm constantly it doesn't come natural to me to take care of my body. I very easily succumb to the problem. The Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh says, forgetting you have a body. He says, when you work on a computer, you forget you have a body. So I tend to treat myself like a machine for all sorts of reasons. And one of the ways that manifests is that even in recovery, even to this day, I can have mild binges. Like, to call it a binge, it's not like a binge in the sense of someone who really identifies with that condition and has binge eating disorder. I can put away way more ice cream than I intend to. So I identify with what you're talking about with regard to potency. Like, I go for potent foods. I love potent foods. A nice, strong ice cream is a lot more powerful than, say, like a low sugar, 80% dark chocolate. But I learned that dark chocolate gives me a kind of different type of potency. And if I savor and I really bring conscious attention to the act of eating it can scratch that itch in a different way. And or if I ask the question, what am I really looking to get out of by finishing off 3/4 of a Ben & Jerry's pint, I can play the tape out and see that doesn't really help me. But I'm not out here floating on a cloud eating broccoli all day. Like, I go through ups and downs. And when I was younger, when I had problems and when my life was more chaotic, in my childhood when both my parents were struggling with alcoholism. I do recall like really serious, at that point, like serious binges, including when I was trying to get on the wrestling team to impress a girl in my school. And I'm 6'3". I'm not a good fit for a wrestling program. You cut to a particular weight. So I had to I'm 6'3". I was made to cut down to 152 pounds.
Wow.
And that really put me on like a seesaw of trying to force. And so there were some times that I binged, and then I felt like a lot of regret and shame, and then I would purge afterward. But it never really solidified into a cycle. I can just see that like on the spectrum from orderly to disordered, like I'm there. I'm not a zero. I've got some dose of disorder.
That's what we would probably call pre or early addiction. But I want to make sure we get to the issue of harm reduction and abstinence. So I'm going to play the devil's advocate. I am actually somebody who's quite strong-minded about the concept of abstinence. I'm going to say, and I want you to rebut me, please, I invite you to, using your perspective, that in this progression of addiction, the Koop's model, that there is a certain point, he calls it hypercataxia. There is a point at which it becomes too painful to use or not use. And so something has happened. There's been enough of a neuroadaptation that's happened. There's enough hypersensitivity that you got to stop. Because if you don't stop, you can't moderate. You can't live life anymore. So I'm going to make the argument that at some point, abstinence is essential for recovery. Now, I want your perspective. How does harm reduction fit in?
There's a lot there. I still don't hear any fundamental problem in any sort of conflict between harm reduction and abstinence there. Okay. You could say very clearly, and I say as a clinical psychiatrist at a certain point, the right choice is abstinence. So if I get a patient, for example, who comes to me for an initial consult and they say, I'm at the end of my rope, doc, I don't know what to do. What do you think I should do? Then I'll very happily give them the recommendation. You should pursue abstinence by any means necessary. Here are the tools we can employ: biological, psychological, social, community, interpersonal, etc., whatever. The fact of the matter is a lot of people don't ask that question. They don't say, I'm game for whatever. They say, I don't want to stop using. I'm not ready to stop, or I'm ambivalent. Maybe I'll give it a try. And then their intention wavers, and then they go back. And meeting the person exactly where they are on their recovery journey and trying to do the best you can by them in that moment is totally compatible with still having the assessment in this example that abstinence is the right recommendation. It's the right choice. It's the best possible outcome. But we have to be pragmatic about it.
What do you say? What do you say instead then? So, and still be true to your purpose?
I think it depends on the situation and what the person says. If they say, I'm not ready to stop, I don't feel like it, that's a hell of a lot different than if they say, I'm really trying to and I feel as if I can't. I think there's a lot of value in breaking down the idea of volition. Here's another, we could spend all day on this one too, but you use some language that suggests there's a checkpoint, and past a certain checkpoint, somebody loses the capacity to choose. And choice and volition are some of the most complex and unresolved psychological and neurobiological phenomena that we have. It's not a unitary component. It's not like a gas tank that you exhaust and then somebody loses the capacity for choice in all points and all times. Actually, people with very severe addictions exercise a lot of choice. They often go through profound planning and deferred gratification processes to get their drug of choice. So it's not so much that there's like a binary choiceless division. It's that choice arises in a particular context. And we have to be, I think, very curious. As a clinician, like returning it to the example of an individual clinician working with an individual patient, I would just get very curious about, oh, you said you couldn't choose. It felt as if you couldn't choose. Tell me more about that. What felt like, where did you have some control? Where did you have some hesitation? What did it actually feel like in that moment, in your body, in your thoughts, etc.? And it's for precisely that reason that people like Bill Miller got very interested in motivational interviewing. And Bill Miller is a very deep thinker when it comes to choice. He wrote a very good paper actually called the Free Will as a Proportion of Variance, I think back in the 80s, maybe the early 90s. And he talks about free will. He's very interested in the question of somebody who may have ambivalence about stopping a substance or an addictive pattern. How do you actually help them to do the thing they say they want to do? And that naturally invokes questions of free will. If I don't have free will, then why is it? Or if I do have free will, then why is it that I keep on doing this thing that I say I don't want to do? And so his answer, as far as I remember it, it's been a while since I looked at it, is there in the title. It's free will as a proportion of variance. It's not a binary phenomenon. It's that there's all sorts of factors that contribute to whether or not somebody exercises quote unquote will in a given moment.
So I guess what I would hope that you could clarify is that I'm a harm reduction clinician. Vera is definitely more abstinence based. And so we harm reduction. Clinicians know that abstinence is the goal of harm reduction, like that they are the same thing. But abstinence-based people give us the feedback that harm reduction is moderation and that we're, like you said, letting people use. And so that's where I want just a little clarification where that they are the same thing. And that if you only are offering abstinence to people, that is actually a huge barrier to recovery.
Yeah. I think harm reduction is like a big baggy concept that maybe is not even useful as a label. I think it's very useful as a social movement and as an organizing philosophy for care. But people mean a lot of different things by harm reduction. I described this a little bit in the book, that people have written whole books about harm reduction. Myas Falovitz is one of them, where harm reduction exists simultaneously as a set of, in the traditional substance use field in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, especially, a set of concrete interventions. Harm reduction could be just like, it's a good thing to have a syringe service program. It'd be better to have sterile needles than ones that aren't sterile. That's a very simple, straightforward thing. It was very controversial at a certain time. It's not super controversial now anymore, at least within certain circles. Harm reduction is also a revolutionary social movement. There are people who say that harm reduction is about overturning late-phase capitalism. So these are not the same things. And so I would be very cautious about just ascribing any sort of viewpoint or necessary intervention to harm reduction. I don't know what harm reduction is. I think it just matters who the person is in that context, how they're using it. And that's the essence of a pragmatic approach. Pragmatic and pluralistic is two buzzwords that have gotten a lot of play in general psychiatry, just that be pragmatic about a specific place and time. Pluralistic meaning that we can admit multiple explanations at the same time. And in your question about some people say it's moderation, some people say it's abstinence, we can easily resolve that by getting past the labels and saying, what is it that you're saying to the patient? What is your goal? Let's talk about what the goal is. Let's talk about what the actual counseling is. Let's look at what works and what doesn't. Very simple. We don't have to assort ourselves into tribes about it.
Yeah, I guess the problem being that people that are so abstinence-based are seeing as like, oh, you're giving them permission to use. And how is that aligned with treatment?
Again, I'm just wondering about what it is you're doing and saying. And what do they have an issue with?
Like how you meet the person where they're at and build that rapport and let them determine on their own that this maybe is not actually working for them and over time, right?
Yeah. Tell me more. What is the distinction between, quote, harm reduction and abstinence and food addiction treatment?
Let me speak for the abstinence piece. It would be that we have to remove, in order to achieve and maintain long-term sobriety without the feeling of deprivation and freedom from obsession, we have to remove sugar and probably refined processed foods from our diet. And then we will be in remission from our addiction. Until that happens, we are continually suffering under the yoke of the addiction. There, that's my piece. Go ahead, Clarissa.
So when I work with clients, they might still be occasionally using, maybe it's, on Fridays, I always have pizza. And so I'm going to still want to have pizza or I'm not going to be willing to work on treatment. And they have the pizza. I'm like, can we do it mindfully? Can we eat with the family? It's very different from eating in isolation than in social settings. But again, I'm not going to tell them they can't eat the pizza. I'm just going to let them come to their own decision. Because then they lost
treatment.
So does this work for you or does this not? And then we're going to explore it the next day or the next time I meet with them. How did that go? Did that work for you? Did it make you continue to use the rest of the weekend? And I find that then they are able to make their own determination that every time I have that Friday night pizza, it actually doesn't work for me. And then I find the buy-in lasts longer rather than me just telling them you're not allowed to eat the pizza.
So Vera, what would you say to the person who says, I want to have the Friday night pizza? What do you actually say to that individual?
I would say, okay, have the Friday night pizza, but remember that you're going to suffer and then you're going to come back and say, I can't do this. It's just too hard. Maybe I should just stop. I mean, say if you really want to be free from the yoke of the addiction, you got to bite the bullet.
So honestly, it sounds like the two of you are very similar in approach, even though you perceive a difference between yourselves. And Vera, you just sound a little more confident about what's going to happen on the front end.
Yeah.
That's my honest feedback. Well, so I don't think, making that into a story about one of you is abstinence and one of you is harm reduction is maybe counterproductive. Like maybe you don't need to put those labels on it.
Yeah.
I feel the same way.
We're representing the larger world in the food.
Right. The larger food addiction world. Whereas like most of it's like very 12-step. I will say it's very 12-step. There's OA, gray sheet,
a whole bunch of pretty rigid programs that create safety, abstinence-based, that creates safety for people. And so sometimes there's not a lot of us that are, and both Molly and I worked in addiction prior to moving in food addiction. And we know that harm reduction is the best practice in that field. So we wanted to bring it to food addiction. And that's where there's been a bit of a pushback in some ways.
Yeah. So like a very specific distinction would be, we see this in substance use disorder treatment, and it was definitely more common in the past, that people might say something like, if you're trying to work on your heroin use, you have to stop all substances. Just an example. And if you don't do that, if you're not entirely abstinent, then you're not following our program. You can't come to our program and we'll kick you out because you're not following our recommendations. And because we're sure that you're going to fail. And that's misguided, and that loses an opportunity. It just loses the opportunity of practicing with the person, having reps that you're putting in, having multiple bites at the apple where you're trying to occasion some change. That's a different calculation than saying, if you're using alcohol, you can't come to this group because the other people here have agreed to be absent from alcohol. And so we just don't think it'd be a good fit. So you're going to have to find another group. That's much more defensible. So I think even in programs that are supposedly abstinence-based versus not, you can find shades of gray, and you can find wholesome motivations. You can find misguided and harmful motivations for what might be labeled as abstinence-based. And so, again, I'm maybe overly academic and intellectual about sort of some of these things, but I think there's a lot of value just constantly investigating and being humble about these labels we put on things, which applies to addiction too. Another big theme from the book is that people like to use the word addiction. They've used it ever since the word came into the English language around the time of Shakespeare in the 16th century. They act as if it means one thing. It actually means a lot of things. And it means a lot of things for linguistic, philosophical, cultural, medical, scientific reasons. So if nothing else, if we just pause and we ask, what do you mean by that? What do you mean when you identify as a person with addiction? What do you mean when you say, I'm following an abstinence-based approach? I think that can be a very useful path forward, not just for the individual, but for the field to come together and find points of contact rather than constant divisions.
I find your philosophical and I guess more academic speculations very intriguing. But I'll be honest with you, it's the fact that you have personal experience that I'm willing to trust that. Because I've read other people who have been speculative and I think, they don't really know. They're not in the field. They're not in the trenches. But you are. So I really appreciate that you have both your feet in both camps.
Thank you for saying that. Yeah, it matters a lot to me. And I think it matters too. It mattered to my own self-perception. I've heard from readers that it has been influential to them too. I think addiction is one of the most complicated and fascinating issues that we face in all of psychology and psychiatry. And there's a lot to gain by taking it seriously.
Awesome. I know you have a hard stop and I want to respect your time, and I know we get to have you back because I want to talk about the podcast treatment, all the things. But I do want to ask you this one signature question because I'm very curious about it. And it is, if you could tell a younger version of yourself something about addiction, now that you've done all of this research, what would you tell young Carl?
Oh man, that's so resonant because when I was writing the book, I looked through old journals and there was so much struggle, so much shame and self-criticism and inadequacy. Like, why can't you just do it yourself? Why is this so hard for you? Can you just stop? I'm one of the people who really tried hard for a long time. And like tracking drinks, if there were moderation apps, I would have used all apps. For me, it wasn't that long ago, it was the thousands. I would put a physical sheet of paper on the wall and be tracking it and trying to go to yoga and trying to meditate every day and just force myself to do it myself. And that didn't get me anywhere. It wasn't enough. And so I guess what I would say to that person, especially once he started to worry that he had an addiction, is don't do it alone. You just don't have to. There's no point. It doesn't have to be clinical treatment. It doesn't have to be 12-step, but there's a lot of help out there. Don't have to do it alone. And
right on.
If that's your starting point, then there's a lot of good ways to go.
I love that. Thank you so much for being here today with us. And we didn't even get close to answering most of the questions, but we had such a great discussion. So I'm so looking forward to having you back.
Anytime. It's a great pleasure. I really appreciate you too in this fascinating discussion. I'm very interested in food and other types of so-called behavioral addictions. I look forward to keeping chatting about it.
Thank you
so much.
Thanks for joining us this week on Food Junkies, Recovery from Food Addiction. Make sure to join our Facebook group, Sugar Free for Life support group, I'm Sweet Enough. You can subscribe to our show in iTunes or Stitchers. That way you'll never miss an episode. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes. Or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out too. Don't forget to pick up your copy of Dr. Tarman's book, Food Junkies, which is available on Amazon. If you have any additional questions, both Molly and Clarissa are food addiction professionals and work one-on-one with clients. You can find their websites and email addresses in the show notes. Be sure to tune in every Friday when our new episodes drop. As Vera loves to say, the power is ours.